Hello, and welcome to Season 4 of our Parallel Paths, a future for my loved one with a disability and for me. I'm your host, Gerry, Dr. Geralyn Arango Deeley, and this podcast is about just what the title says, the parallel paths of family members, certainly parents, sometimes siblings as parents age or pass on, and their loved ones with intellectual disabilities. I'm a parent myself, and I always have questions. Our parallel paths is about nurturing and supporting ourselves as we nurture and support our loved ones with intellectual disabilities. Our roles as family members are ever-changing and evolving alongside our loved ones, so there's more than one path, more than one future to talk about, and that's why we're here. And I hope that the stories and perspectives of my podcast guests and me give you hope, information, and ideas for your path. So a couple months ago, I came across an article in a 2022 issue of Psychology Today entitled Chronic Sorrow, A Grief That Never Ends by Mark Shelvach. A grief that never ends. So one part of me is like, no thank you, been there, done that, turn the page. And one part, what does that title mean anyway? Because chronic sorrow is different from grief? As I read the article, I think the answer got a little clearer, and I saw, although I didn't want to see, that chronic sorrow describes a bit of my own path and my life as it is. The author provided me with a new term, chronic sorrow, to describe a feeling in myself that I had really never named. The term chronic sorrow gave me a possible description of a part of my experience and my emotions about my son, my Nick, who has a significant disability. So I kind of want to flesh that out. You know, grief doesn't just disappear after someone dies, but in my experience, the person will always be gone. And yet the feeling of the loss evolves. What initially may feel like being pinned under a boulder and you can't get out from under it can lighten over time, and the boulder maybe hones down a little bit as you share memories and stories of the person and celebrate their life because you're beginning to heal. Eventually, that boulder of grief smooths down even more into a rock and then maybe a stone, something that's small enough for you to carry in your pocket, but you'll always carry it. The other kind of grief can be anticipatory grief, as we're waiting for someone to die. What I'm hearing in both of these types of grief is die. Hearing that permanent loss, that empty seat at the table. I kind of want to better understand chronic sorrow and if it applies to folks like us on the parallel path as a type of grief or what? Because what do grief and chronic sorrow have in common? How's chronic sorrow different from grief? Because I don't think they're quite interchangeable, but I'm not sure. And if you or I or anyone you know experience chronic sorrow, what can we do to both acknowledge the feelings and the experience that might be coloring our lives to some greater or lesser extent, but to grow and thrive as well as we live in this experience with chronic sorrow, all the while supporting the loved one whose very being may be integral to why we feel some level of chronic sorrow. Now, sidebar, as I read this, and I read other articles too, I realized that chronic sorrow is not just a feeling applicable to people impacted by the life of someone with an intellectual disability. So keep that in mind as you're listening today. Anyway, time to consult the bigger thinkers with the bigger answers. And today I welcome Maleita Olson back to our parallel paths. Maleita's a licensed clinical social worker, a behavior specialist, a certified autism specialist, an advocate, and a mother of four. She's a senior director and co-founder of Spectra Support Services in Springfield, Pennsylvania. Hey.
Hello.
Listeners, you might remember Maleita from season 3 of our Parallel Paths, where she and I talked about individuation, that learning to step back a bit, to do the work of letting parent and child, and this case, Nick and me, to more clearly establish separate identities, and that does not make me a bad parent. And neither does asking the question on occasion, Gerry, what do you want? I'm still working on individuating, and so listeners, if you haven't heard this individuation episode with Maleita from last season, you might want to check it out and see if you find a little wisdom to consider, because I did. So, welcome again, Maleita, and thank you for returning to the podcast. Another episode, another couple of questions.
Always excited to be here.
Yay. So, I got to parse out this chronic sorrow grief thing. And let me start by saying, to remove my guilt, I love my children. I have done my best to be a good parent. I have watched this role of parent change through the decades as my babies became adults. But in Nick's case, I've also watched parts of my role stay the same, even as he edges toward 30. I mean, sometimes it's no biggie. I know he needs support. But sometimes seeing my role stay the same can be really hard. And it makes me kind of sad. And sometimes I just go down this dark rabbit hole of worry, too. That role staying the same also keeps me in roles many parents kind of grow out of, as their children need less support. And so is this what we're talking about? Is this chronic sorrow? Is this grief? Is this something else?
So I think that's a great question. And I don't think that there are as many opinions about this as there are about other topics. And so I think it really is about how you personally interpret it. There are research articles, there's starting to be research on this, but it's sort of a new way to frame what we've always known. And so it's not easy to come out and say, this is chronic sorrow and this is grief. I think there's a little bit of a way in which they kind of blend into each other, and it really depends on how you use it. But let's get back to sort of the core issues. The core issues the core issues are that we have little losses all the way through. And one of the things I think as parents that we're sort of not really enculturated to embrace is that we have a right to anything that makes us sad about being a parent. So I can think back, and this has nothing to do with special needs. I can think back to when I was pregnant with my first child, and everyone's just like, has that image of baby and infant is so wonderful and so amazing. So you're just going to love it. And I was like, it sucked. I mean, I don't mean I didn't have beautiful moments. I had a lot of beautiful moments, but I always say to people, I was like, I am not a baby mama. Like I hand them to me at 4 or 5 years old. I'm golden, but the guilt I felt for having that opinion that it wasn't okay to sort of say, this is not fun. This is awful. I'm not sleeping. I'm tied to this human being. And it was just part of what I had to go through in my sort of transformation of my role, right? The role of who I was before I was a parent, the role of who I was to an infant who needs constant care. And then the other piece of it, whenever you have one loss, they tend to be a little bit like Velcro. They kind of pick up other losses in your life.
Ooh. And
they sort of stick to each other. So we have to be aware of that as well. But as a parent, I feel like we're sort of enculturated as though if you experience any feeling of loss as a parent other than the actual loss of your child, you're not justified to have those sad feelings, because as a parent, you're supposed to love. And we sort of have, I think, modified our concept of love to not include loss. But love and loss go together. Like I once read something that, said, the opposite of love is not hate, it's fear, or there's lots of ways, or indifference, or things like that. So it's about love being both and I think we tend to like to be dichotomous in our society, like to think it's this or that. And I think you can be a parent and you can be angry at your circumstances, for example, which is where I think this journey starts for a lot of people who come to know that their child has special needs. There is this fear And then there's confusion, and then there's loss. There's this loss of lots of different things. Like, what would you say were some of the losses when you came to know Nick would be different?
Gosh, I mean, we were so immersed in all of the health things that were sort of glaringly over the top different. But the fact that there were people in our house who were not there for when my daughter was there. All these early intervention, wonderful people, but there were a bunch of people coming through all week long to work with him at home because all those typical milestones weren't happening. And so as much as it was great to have all this help, I didn't need it the first time around, and it felt different. And I mean, I think of that really, really early on. And I think about actually a lot of the school years of a lot of people reminding me that he wasn't what he was, quote unquote, supposed to be. And that was really hard too, because I used to literally wait for the word but. They would tell me how wonderful he was. And I would just listen and be like, 5, 4, 3, 2. But, and, you're like,
Right. So in that story alone, there's so many little losses, right? I can hear there's a loss of your privacy, right? You have strangers coming in and out of your home. There's a loss of your own ability to kind of rate yourself as a parent because you have all these professionals coming in telling you what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong. And yes. I remember myself, I used to be one of those professionals back in the day. I graduated with a master's degree at 22 years old, and I'm going into families' homes doing early intervention, telling them how to discipline their kids. And I remember walking away like, who the heck am I? Who am I telling these? But I did have some good ideas, and I was trained, and I did have something to offer. But to really step back and recognize that, I think there's a loss of being able to feel centered, that I am the expert on my own kid, which I think we more typically feel as when we're talking about raising our neurotypical children. Yeah. And it's almost like we're robbed of that security that we know how to raise our child.
Yes. Yes.
That we're robbed of that security so that it's something that a doubt that's always sort of sitting beside every decision we make. And I think there's also the loss that in what you're saying in that particular situation, there's this loss that my decisions for this child are short term. For example, if you think about your older daughter, it's like something you might look back on and regret. Like for me personally, I did the whole Ferber method, let them cry it out. I regret that to this day. That's my choice. I mean, I'm not judging other people who do it. I just personally have come to believe that was not a choice reflective of who I am and how I wanted to parent. And so I listened to some expert, I did something, and I regretted it. But I also, when I came to that realization, like, and I didn't end up doing it with my other 2 children, I didn't say to myself, I am not a worthy parent because I made this mistake. And I also didn't say to myself, that child is forever screwed up for the rest of their lives. And I feel as though when I interact in my own decisions with my own children that have various different kinds of special needs, and when I interact with parents like yourself, there's this sense of every decision is going to impact the rest of their life. Every single decision. I've got to get every decision right. So there's a loss of ability to make mistakes. Okay. There's this loss of I'm allowed to stumble through this and make mistakes and not get it right, and their life is not doomed.
And there's systems that are reminding us that all the time. And those are the systems that our children need. And so, and for some people, they're truly seen as the experts. And so if the experts say I'm not doing it right at an early age, then, as my child grows up and becomes an adult, that doesn't go away.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. And so then that security, you just sort of, and that's what makes it a chronic loss. It's not like you lost it that day that first professional made you doubt yourself. You now carry that as one of the, to use your stone metaphor. It's like you've got this stone in your backpack, that is just weighing you down because somebody put it in there. I remember myself sitting in an ISP meeting when my son, I think I may have mentioned this in the other webcast, but my son was in second grade and it was an IEP for children, an IEP meeting. And I was trying to explain to them that every time he got home from school, he was having meltdowns, and they turned and said, "What are you doing wrong?" And I was just like, no, he's holding it together in school because he's gifted enough to have that particular ability at this point in his life. And when he gets home and it's safe, he lets loose. Mm-hmm. But that's like an example of an expert looking and making, I was grateful that I had a professional background to say, nay, mm-hmm. That's not right. I know I'm right. I know it's the exact opposite. He's doing that around me because he feels safe, because he has not had a chance to let down all day long. And he just has to let go because he held it together all day. And isn't that amazing? But it's those kinds of things, I think, mm-hmm. that, it's that loss of kind of getting to parent in private. It's like your parenting is being paraded in an IEP meeting. Yeah. Your parenting is being paraded when you go to a restaurant and your child has a meltdown because something that another child wouldn't be triggered by, your child is, or you're constantly being paraded, especially, in your case, there's two different situations, but if you have a child with Down syndrome, or you have a child with cerebral palsy, or a child with other kinds of visible disabilities, mm-hmm. then you can be just looked at.
Oh, yeah.
Will be just looked mm-hmm. at in public. And so there's this loss of, I could just walk through a mall and not be stared at, and so mm-hmm. there's just, it's almost like we might want to call them like micro losses, okay. And it's when you have all these micro losses together, they kind of stitch themselves together and they become about chronic grief, chronic loss or chronic grief, chronic sorrow, right? So it's sort of like they kind of, all play with each other. I think the other piece is chronic, right? The word chronic means there's no foreseeable end. And so we sort of culturally have this sense that grief has a process. It doesn't mean that you stop missing the person who has left your life, or you start missing the thing that has completely left your life. My parents moved from New England to Pennsylvania. There was sort of a chronic grief to not living in New England. Mm-hmm. I don't think they ever fit in and loved Pennsylvania 100%. I think they liked it, but I think there was this chronic, where I was raised, where, mm-hmm. And so that sort of chronic is because it doesn't get to resolve, but grief kind of has stages, as we know, and grief kind of, not everyone can move through them, but it has a pattern of resolution. But that's because the loss, it's like the loss broke, like it broke. This is almost, it kind of reminds me, my son actually, about a month ago, he bent his arm. I didn't know you could do that. It's something. Yes, it's literally called a green stick fracture. And the image that the doctor told me, so when they did the X-ray, it didn't say that his arm was broken. Okay. It said no fracture, but the doctor that was there, the PA that was there in the urgent care said, "I've been around kids a long time. Something is wrong with his arm." So the next day we go to the orthopedist, and the orthopedist does another X-ray. He looks at it and he says, "Here," and he puts those little dots. I don't know if you've ever had like an ultrasound or whatever. Those mm-hmm. little dots, and he measures. He's like, "It's bent. His arm is bent." I was like, "What are you talking about?" And he's like, "Well, it's bent." And he said, "If you can imagine a stick," and unfortunately, mm-hmm. your listeners can't see this, but if you imagine a stick and you imagine when you bend it, it has all these micro fractures as you're bending it, but it doesn't break. Right. Okay. It's just not quite enough force to break. It just mm-hmm. bends. So that metaphor kind of reminds me of sort of this chronic sorrow. It's like when it's a break, it's actually a little bit easier to heal because you take the break and you either cast it and put it back in the right space and it heals, or you literally open up and pin it together, and it heals in the right space. And so it's a path to healing. It's painful, but it has a path to healing. And I feel as though chronic sorrow is kind of like getting your bone bent. Like it's just these micro fractures.
That's a helpful image.
It's like these micro fractures. And I think the most important piece is that just like the radiologist who read that first x-ray, unless you know what you're looking for, unless you know the particulars of that particular condition, you're not going to notice. You're not going to notice. It's not going to be obvious.
Okay.
And I think that's what happens. I think that special needs parents carry with them sort of this chronic sorrow, and because it's not about things that other people feel sorrow about, they don't even notice it sometimes.
Okay.
And definitely others.
Okay. All right. I think about a couple of different things. I heard you saying about chronic. I look at my notes, and I was saying to you beforehand that I didn't have like a linear group of questions for you. I kind of was like listening for where this was going, and that bend was really an interesting way of seeing it because it had all the fractures, it had all these little micros. And I think that is a way of kind of conceptualizing the bend. And the bend that is our lives, it's not the usual life, and what it's made of, and all these pieces. And I think about those little triggers along the way that all of a sudden you feel like, I wish. And how to kind of get through those where you feel like, oh, I wish that my child didn't have such a hard time. I used to say I would cut off a body part if Nick's seizures would stop. And it was like, you can cut it off, but it's not going to stop it. So you feel that sense of frustration. I remember telling my students, when they would talk about an IEP meeting and the parent was so difficult, and I would say, having been one, oops, I said a lot of times what you're hearing may be directed at you and what you're doing or whatever, but first it goes through themselves. I think that the place that we went first was, if I'd have only done something differently, if I'd have only, this wouldn't be a problem. So we go to a place where we internalize the things that our kids are struggling with as a failure in ourselves.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think it kind of dovetails on what I was referencing earlier. I have found that, I've been a therapist now for 15 years, maybe. In clinical therapy, I've been a social worker for a lot longer than that. But in clinical therapy, it's been about maybe 15 years. And in that time frame, what I've really come to understand is that there has been this cultural shift, and I don't know, and we're not here to figure out the philosophy behind it, but I will say that it's important to acknowledge that there's been this cultural shift that if anything goes wrong, we're at fault. I think about that, what was it like for my grandparents? And it was like, maybe it was too much the other way. It was God's punishing me, different. Right? God's punishing me because this went wrong. But, and I don't think that's healthy either. But I think the piece of which that made it a little bit better was that it wasn't my fault. It's almost as though we can call it all kinds of names, but it's almost as though the responsibility, and this is what I was referencing before, it's like the responsibility that everything goes perfectly for my child is mine as their mother, or mine as their father, or mine as their caregiver, whatever it is. It's like everything is my responsibility. And that weight is just so overwhelming, and it's not possible. That's the other piece. It's not possible. It is not. And you can do everything right. There's parents out there who may be listening to this who have children with or without disabilities who went off the rails and struggled with drug addiction, or struggled with alcohol, or struggled with other things. And those parents are saying the same thing.
Yes.
Where did I go wrong? What did I do? How did I not?
Yeah, that's what I was saying about, this is not just the purview of the parent of a person with intellectual disability.
It's not.
And I thought of that. People who whose children have some form of mental illness, people whose children have a substance abuse problem, that you're doing that same thing and feeling those feelings of, if only, I had done something different. And
so I think
that's not fair, but but it is.
It's not.
As it is.
And I think that, so when we talk about, the chronic part of sorrow, I think part of it, the whole idea is that it's never ending, right? Nick is going to have Down syndrome today. Nick had Down syndrome the moment he was conceived, and Nick will have Down syndrome someday on his last breath.
Yep.
He has Down syndrome. I have a son on the autism spectrum. He had it day one. We didn't know it then. We came to know it. We know it now. He'll have it forever. So there's this sense of that piece is not changeable. So I think when we start trying to think about it, the first piece is to feel entitled to the sorrow that comes with things that are not changeable. It's it's almost the serenity prayer, right? Grant me the serenity to understand the things that I can't change. What is not in my control?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that I don't get to be mad about it, or I don't get to be upset, or I don't get to deal with it in whatever way works for me. And I know when I'm working with parents, when they're newly diagnosed, one of the things that's the biggest challenge is that they have very different ways to handle it. I'll have, if there is a situation where you have two parents, for example, you'll have one parent, and it doesn't necessarily follow gender lines. It's personality driven.
That was on my list of questions when mom and dad or whoever take it differently.
Absolutely. One parent can go all in. I'm going to find I'm going to find the right diet. I'm going to find the right doctor. And they just go all into action mode. And then some people freeze, right? And some people avoid. I mean, it's stress. So just like any stress, you can, we always think fight or flight, but there's fight. So there's parents that get the fight in them. There's flight, like they just escape either into, by literally escaping, unfortunately. Some people just
marriages
walk away.
Don't always last.
People unfortunately say, I can't,
Yeah.
It might be the right decision for them, but they can't care for that child. So they have to make that very heart-wrenching decision. But so you have fight, you have flight. But what people also don't realize, there's also freeze, right? There's also this I just freeze. I just don't know what to do. I don't know how to handle it. This is not something you have a script for. We don't have a script for parenting to begin with, other than let me copy what my parents did or decide to be the polar opposite and some combination thereof. Right. So I'm some combination thereof. But we don't have a script for how to be a special needs parent, right? There's no script for that. And at the same time, we're trying to develop our own script. We're getting judged at all sides. And so it's really, really difficult. So I think one piece of this is, how do we get to the chronic sorrow of just saying, I get to be sad. I get to be sad that this is difficult for me. That's not selfish. That's human. It's human to say, this is difficult. This is hard. This is
it's
more.
It's long term.
It's more than I signed up for.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it have parallels. Like chronic sorrow kind of was born out of this relationship, a parent of a special needs child. And then they said, well, it's also what it's like for the spouse or child caregiver of a parent with dementia, which is another road you're familiar with.
Yep.
And then it's also the journey of someone with chronic illness. If if you have Parkinson's disease, or you have multiple sclerosis, or something like that, it's not going to let go. Like there's not going to be this letting go. So how do I learn to cope with it? And I think part of it is, first of all, acknowledging it. I have a right to say that anything that's chronic is just hard. I often say to myself, like, I'm blessed. I don't have, at this moment in my life, I'm sure someday I might, but at this moment in life, I don't have any chronic illness that causes pain, but I have relatives that do. I have relatives that live in absolute chronic pain. And so when I get like that headache that like won't go away for 2 days once in a great while, I was like, how the hell do you live like this?
I know. Yeah.
And I feel that compassion for other parents that are, physically carrying. I've seen 80-pound mothers in their 60s lifting, you know, 150-pound, children, taking care of them.
So our first stop is to just acknowledge that, sometimes this is just so hard.
And you're not supposed to feel guilty for thinking it's hard.
That's the key
piece.
also.
That's the piece. It's okay to say it's hard, and it's okay to not feel guilty that it feels hard. It is hard. It is hard. It is absolutely hard. But it's not hard because you set it up that way. Right. You didn't set it up that way. And it's not hard because you screwed up and your child is this way.
And in that moment when you're about to have a good cry because it's just too much. Any ideas? Besides, I mean, I'm a fan of the good cry, but what else?
I think you have the good cry.
You have the good cry.
You have the good cry, and you acknowledge not just that it is hard, but you also acknowledge there's a part of my heart that wishes I had the magic wand that could fix this. Whatever this is, if this is, part of what you're saying. I think one of the hardest parts, I just went through this recently with one of my own children, and they're also young adults, and I have to be careful because she might listen to this. But when I went through this with my child, just sort of being like, it's just so helpless when I see you struggling and I can't fix it. It's so helpless to stand back and just be the parent that lets you go through it on your own and figure it out. And I know you're capable of it. It's not that I didn't believe that my child was capable of it. They're absolutely capable of it. But it was just like, I just had to say, this is just so hard because seeing you suffer hurts. Mm-hmm. What hurts you hurts me. Mm-hmm. And that connection is what's so powerful, and I think maybe that's a piece of what you're alluding to. I think they don't ever completely leave the nest. They don't,
not in the same way.
Not in the same way.
I mean, Nick is living here in the condo, and people sort of say, "Oh, it's so great." I've heard this a couple of times lately that he's independent, and it was like, "Oh, okay," but then it's like, you don't get that. Or you're retired from your job and now you have this freedom. And it was like, no, I spent a lot of time on 95 back and forth. I do a lot of texting, I do calling, I do whatever to kind of keep this going. There's so much else going on that, yes, it's all about his interdependence, but this is work most people don't have to do with their 26-year-old child, at least not to this extent. I'm glad I'm doing it. I love seeing the success, and Michael, my husband, is always kind of reminding me, like, yeah, we're going to have high turnover. We're going to have, stuff. But to me, it's like, well, why don't you like my son? Or why don't you like me? And it gets all very personalized. And and that's, I think, that piece of the sorrow of like, well, is it me or is it him? Or, just going those blamey places.
Yeah. And that's, so when you say, what do you do after you go a good cry? You go and you just say, I had this wonderful worker that used to go around and just say, it is what it is. Mm-hmm. And I love that and she would do that when we'd have this big crisis and a behavior outburst and all this other stuff. Cause I work with this population. And then when it's all over, she's just like, it is what it is. It was what it was. And now what? And I think that that's part of it, is just being able to say, it is what it is. In other words, I can't change it. It is what it is. It's not my fault.
Which is probably something to sort of like have as a mantra, that you have to continually remind yourself of that.
Yes.
And that's where, after I have the smaller pity party, then I can go back to that and say, no, we're doing the best we can. It isn't my fault, and people are, you have to kind of recalibrate a lot, where, in all fairness to the whole wide world, I can't generalize the whole wide world, but where other more typical situations, that's done, or rarely revisited, but it's a constant.
I think what's really important here, and it's interesting because before we started, we were chatting and you mentioned something about when people feel sort of compassion for loss, the next sentence often is something it's funny. I grew up on Annie the musical. It's like the sun will come out tomorrow, right? Mm-hmm. That's always the next phrase. So, you lose someone. I'm sorry for your loss. They're in a better place. So it's somehow this happy thing, which can be equally true, right? Mm-hmm. There are a lot of people when, if you believe in an afterlife, and even if you don't, like if somebody was really chronically suffering with dementia, suffering with physical illness, suffering with pain, and they pass away, we can say, oh, that pain is ending, but that relief it's not a wipeout. It doesn't just wipe out the other pain. You know what I mean? They're held together. And I think that if there's a central theme to this, it's like, how do you hold both emotions together? And the chronic sorrow and the chronic is a funny word to use, but sort of this chronic joy too. It was unexpected sorrow, right? Nobody expects to have a child with special needs. Nobody goes, seeks or doesn't seek to, become a parent. And, well, I shouldn't say that. Some people do. They adopt children with special needs. But by and large, most people don't know it's going to happen until it's upon them. And when it's, upon you, whether by choice, which I greatly admire, we have more and more people doing that, which is such a blessing to our whole society. Mm-hmm. And that you have to recognize that you're trying to hold both. You're trying to hold, there is a joy in it. There are things that you've experienced that no other parent has experienced. And there are things about you as a mother and a person that would have never grown had you not been Nick's mother.
I would like to believe that. And I kind of sometimes do, And the other thing is about what you would not have been or who you would not have met is I think, the importance of the people in your life. And I divide them up into the people. When you see them, you have to kind of start your story with what, once upon a time, like you're starting from the beginning. And I found tremendous comfort and all kinds of other good stuff, validation, support, fun with the friends that I start the sentence with. And then this happened. You know what I mean? There's people who are kind of, you love them and they're everything and they're wonderful, but they don't really kind of get this. And so other family members of people with disabilities, they may get it. And sometimes that particular friend or two or group or whatever, that you're knowing that you have an identity within that can be a way to cope with the sort of sorrows that we can feel, because they feel them sometimes too. And they, even if it's somewhat different, it's in that area.
I think what you're trying to say is that the sense of community does two things. The one thing the sense of community does is it helps to reinforce that you have a right to that sorrow, right? That you have a right to that sorrow because you're not alone, right? Because that's the other thing. I mean, that's the isolation has got to be one of the most intense parts of being a special needs parent. And so when you can make those connections and you can have that sense of community, you feel embraced and you feel one of the joys, right? One of the joys is having a sense of community that and honestly, neurotypical parents, I can tell you, it's been hard. I've found it so difficult to create community among parents, having raised my kids in the 2000s and still, I still have a middle schooler, so I'm still raised, but it's like the sense of community, even in the 11 years between my oldest and my youngest, it was like, it's
that's interesting. That's interesting because, one of the first things when I found out Nick was going to have Down syndrome was I had to go to Barnes & Noble, go get a book that was Babies with, Down syndrome, a new parent's guide. And I'm like, all right, here we go. And the back, it said support groups. And I'm looking, and in Pennsylvania, it was like, oh, it's in the next town. The next town. It was in Springfield. And I went to Hancock Methodist Church and sat down with a whole room full of people in my big pregnant self. And it was like, oh, and that was a great place to start, with just sort of saying, oh, other people, and look at those kids. Oh my God, that baby's so cute. Just that little bit. And I'm not as much a member of part of that group as I once was, but when we get to the Christmas party, we get to the holiday party, all those things. And everybody is, there's a level of how much fun can a whole group of young people have and cha-cha all around the room kind of thing. Like there's this joy. And so, which is not to be stereotypical, but it's just like, this is just I don't know. It's just different. And there is a lovely camaraderie even with people you don't know very well, because we're all
experience. And that can be really, really powerful. But I think you also are, what your story just reminded me of is that we sort of go through these stages where it plateaus. It being sort of this sense of loss can kind of plateau for a time.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of feel a little healed. And then I think sometimes it surprises us when the next stage makes us feel it again. So for example, it's like, okay, you get to, 14, 15 and you finally sort of have school figured out. You
Mm-hmm.
hope. I know that a lot of people unfortunately don't have that luxury, but you kind of got it figured out. You kind of know what you're doing. And then all of a sudden 14, then they hit puberty. And so the kid that was, really listening and able to be responsive, and you had this bond with, this happens to all parents, and then they turn into what?
You're like, who is this?
But then, for our population, that it can mean really serious stuff. It can mean being attacked. It can mean parents walking out with black and blue eyes. It can mean, a lot of things where all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, I have to acknowledge that something like that. That's a loss. That's a loss. It's a huge loss to say I'm not safe around my own child.
Yep.
My child that I gave birth to is not safe for me to be around. And some families have to even have no choice because the right supports are not there, or that child just cannot exist in a home environment. They have to make that really heart-wrenching choice to have supports, in a different place. And that's a loss. So it's like loss. So it's like, at each stage, and then you're always on that, I'm thinking about the title of your podcast, Parallel Paths. And it also reminds me too, that no matter how hard we try, I think we still, I say we, because I'm also, a parent of special needs. I just had this happen to me where one of my children was going through something, and then maybe 2 or 3 days later, I'm talking to one of my best friends from high school, and her child, approximately the same age, she was about to go get on a plane and move him to Texas for his first job, and he was getting his first apartment. And I was just like,
I heard that sigh coming.
We did it together. It's just like, and you're just like, why is it so hard? And why can't my child be on that timeline? And why? And then it's just, and it's to your point. We have the pity party. We say it's not fair. I wish it were easier for my kid. And then, and then you turn around and you look at what's right in front of you. I think that's the other question you were asking. It's like, what do you do when you get out of the pity party? Well, you look and you look for what is different that wouldn't have happened if that child wasn't, I use the term wired that way because of the way, my son's on the spectrum, or that child wasn't, born with those differences. What would be different? And so, for example, one of the things that went terribly wrong, the person ended up in a position where that child of mine is now really having an impact where they are. And so being like, wait, they were meant to be here. And I was just so stuck on the traditional trajectory that if I can let go of that some more and just embrace where that person is, and it doesn't matter. Like, as long as that person is on the road to happiness. And I think we have to, that's another piece. We have to be on the road to happiness with ourselves and our kids. Never, I think we always want our kids to be happy, and every time they're not, that's a whole other topic. That's maybe another podcast.
But, well, you know what? And that's the truth, to be able to, I think it takes a lot of resolve, but to just sort of say, yeah, this is who this person is, and this is who they helped to make me.
Yes.
And like kudos me, with all the blame I can lay on myself, and I can do a good job of that. Force yourself to say, you know what? Wow. And stay there for a minute.
Yes.
It could last as long as, if not longer than, the pity party. And that would be nice too. But maybe let's be a little nicer to ourselves.
I hear that so hard. Yeah. It's funny. It reminds me. When I'm counseling, I love to go back to this story, and I still remember it. I remember sitting in a Lamaze class kind of thing, childbirth class. And the nurse who was running it looking and saying, "You're going to call it a good day when you get a shower." And I remember just being like, what?
Yeah,
Get out of here. This cannot be true until you're living it. And then you're like, yeah, it's a good day when you get a shower. And I think that's part of what we have to do is lower I don't know where these like off the chart perfectionistic expectations have come from of what we're supposed to be at all times, and that we're supposed to be this protector. And that is another, that's the whole concept of not allowing our kids to fail and failing forward and all of those things. And that's a whole nother, sort of intertwined with individuation, but being able to just, I'm hearing Elsa in my head, let it go. Just let it go. Like, let it go and let go all those expectations and trying to hold yourself accountable for every little thing and just embrace what's right in front of you. That kind of mindfulness mindset. It's like, what is right here, right now? Where's the miracle in this moment? And it might be sitting beside some pretty crappy stuff. Okay. Just say, okay, it is what it is. There's crap and there's good. But never to get too focused on either one, because when you ignore the crap, it grows and it comes back to bite you.
It builds, yeah.
Come back to bite you, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Then let's be a little nicer to ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing the wisdom and the expertise. I think chronic sorrow, and as I said at the very beginning of the podcast, this may resonate with families, and we said it too, with, of course, people with intellectual disabilities, but also maybe those with family members who might be experiencing mental illness or perhaps addictions. And because of that feeling and the same wisdom applying, Can
I interject one more thing as you close? Baby. I have this slide. I used to do this workshop called Next Steps into Adulthood. And very blessed to have had the opportunity to do the keynote. And so these are families that are coming in trying to, kids are 14, 15, 19, 20, trying to figure out how do I support them as they fall off this service cliff at 21, blah, blah, blah. And there's this amazing slide, and I don't know the origin of the quote, so if someone finds it, please let us know. But it basically is this beautiful quote by someone who's autistic, and it goes through, don't mourn for who we are. Take a minute and mourn who you thought we were going to be.
Ooh.
And when you're done with that, basically leave your grief over here and we'll go.
Let's all keep going.
And just like, it's like, you're not really mourning for me. You're mourning for who you thought I should be, could be, would be. That's what you're mourning. And when we let go of that, and it's hard, and it's not a one-time letting go. I think that was what I was trying to say about that last story.
Okay.
It's not a one-time letting go. It's
ongoing.
It's ongoing. I think of it
it's chronic letting go.
It's chronic letting go. And I think of it kind of like a slinky, there's the slinky, and it's a spiral. So it's you're cycling. So you're getting better and you're improving, but you're cycling. You know what I mean? You're coming, if you're holding it vertical, you're on your way up, but you're going to cycle through.
All right. Well, I hope that even that image can gives hope, to those of us who are on the parallel path, and to those who are walking on other parallel paths too, So listeners, thank you so much for spending time with us on today's episode with Maleita Olson on our parallel paths. I hope that you will like and follow our podcast, that you'll share it with family and friends, and I really hope that you'll return to listen and learn from more stories of people like you and me and our loved one with a disability on our parallel paths. You're not alone, and I'll see you next time.